Can't resist the temptation to start with a brief note about Tucker Carlson, the American political commentator, because I think that he, in some ways, has become an interesting bellwether of what's going on in America with respect to Jews. So, not wanting to give a whole history of Tucker Carlson's political evolution, I think it's fair to say that there's a story that's run through different positions he's taken or issues that he's picked up in the last maybe five more or 5 or 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years, which is recognizable to those who have enough sensitivity to the how the details fit together. And what I mean by that is that you can imagine, if someone said, "All right, I'm going to tell you a story," and it's a story about an alien who is fired from his home planet in a an escape pod as a baby, and he lands in Kansas, and he's raised by humans, and he grows up to have superpowers. He wears glasses and pretends that he's a weakling, and he's a reporter, and he works in a city where he's a journalist at a newspaper. I told you all those things, and then I said, do you think that this character that I'm describing has X-ray vision? You'd be like, yeah, sure, because it's Superman, and Superman has X-ray vision. Um, so similarly with Tucker, you can tell what story we're talking about without it necessarily having to be the case that anyone puts the headline, which comic are we reading here? Because, at various times, different kind of stories that he has run and pushed. So I can remember one, I don't know from exactly how many years ago, about a nefarious private equity tycoon who, with his predatory business dealings, had destroyed a small town in Oklahoma or somewhere like that, and caused economic devastation and the shredding of social fabric in small town America. And he's done other stories about how nefarious warmonger policy wonks in the Washington Beltway are always trying to convince everyone in DC that America needs another war because it's good for business and also it's good for Israel. And so they're always trying to convince America to get involved in some other adventure, wars in the Middle East, etc. And he's also had, um, most recently, uh, a story about the persecution of Christians in Israel, um, that is peculiarly upside down insofar as those who are interested in the global trend of persecution of Christians in, for example, the Middle East and North Africa, are usually not focused on Israel as the main offender, for obvious reasons one doesn't need to go into here. But Tucker Carlson chose to put the spotlight on what he was trying to sort of whip up as like an untold story about how things are so bad for Christians in Israel, when he really was interviewing, a representative of a Christian church in Bethlehem who is under the rule more directly of what is called the Palestinian Authority. Um, so those are, a few different miscellaneous stories. There are other ones that one could pull up that fall along similar lines, but there's this thread that runs through it, which obviously you don't need much of a nose to detect, where certain people would say, well, it kind of sounds like this guy's an anti-Semitic, Jew-hating crank, because of the way that there's this kind of continual repetition of, oh, this like private equity tycoon, and he's preying on, small town Americans. It so happens, maybe he's Jewish or maybe he isn't, but obviously works with all those Jewish bankers in New York or whatever. And obviously all the, Washington Beltway policy wonks uh, are neocons, and everyone knows that half the neocons are Jews and they all just want America to fight Israel's wars, et cetera, et cetera. Like that. He's not someone who's standing up and stump speaking about how we have to get rid of the Jews, but clearly, at the very least, what he has identified for a while is that there's an audience for a kind of story that is part of the Superman story, so to speak, even if no one told you the name Clark Kent was part of the story, right? You can tell from enough of the details. This is about the mindset of someone who is kind of looking for conspiracy and looking for a sense of nefarious cabals of, small groups of people controlling them, looking for a sense of America somehow being enslaved to Israel's foreign policy interests, et cetera, balling all of that together and sort of serving it up. And he's been doing that at this point, courting that in his viewership for a while. And I have no desire here to make distinction between the possibility that he's a shrewd businessman who realizes there's a market for this and he's just pandering to that market, or, telling the story that that market wants to listen to, and he doesn't care exactly what the content of it is, or if he's someone who personally kind of can't let go of that issue, like that somehow there's a personal attraction to stories that cast a Jew or the Jews or the Jewish state in this light that, counterposes the Jew with like the interests of normal, decent, wholesome Americans. So maybe, it's both. And, he, so to speak, loves his job and is better at it, or maybe he's just someone who is smart enough to appreciate that there are plenty of Americans who are interested in stories like this, because, he has an enormous viewership, obviously. But I think in a sense, it doesn't matter either way. I'm actually not someone who wants to come along and say, oh, Tucker Carlson is an anti-Semite, he should be silenced, or that's anti-Semitism, that's terrible. Let's all get really worked up about how terrible anti-Semitism is and how it's spreading and how it's on the rise. As we've talked about in other videos, to some degree, while it's certainly the case that Jews should have concern for the safety and well-being of other Jews everywhere, and I feel that very deeply. Talking about anti-Semitism as a problem in this day and age gets very confusing in terms of, the question of what point we're trying to score. Like, are we just trying to get people to admit that this kind of organization of politics and possibly violence against Jews is anti-Semitic, and therefore, because it's bigoted and racist, it's wrong, but this other kind of organizing politics and violence against Jews that we could somehow manage to prove is not anti-Semitic would be okay? That obviously isn't really the way one wants to go. And yet, the reason I think it's interesting is because when you look in the specifically American context, the fact that someone like Tucker Carlson is sensing kind of growth industry in talking this way and throwing in some UFO conspiracy theory stuff too, because you're probably talking with a tinfoil hat crowd once you connect the dots between Israel making America fight its wars and, nefarious tech tycoons and private equity people destroying privacy and shredding social fabric and everything else, right? Like once you sort of lay all of that out, like who's really interested in that story? Maybe they also are really interested in the X-Files kind of stuff and with aliens. So fine. So he throws that into the mix. As a hilarious aside, for some reason, also Tucker Carlson has decided to become a propaganda outlet for Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia. and as a result went to Russia and did these sort of propaganda videos for Putin, including a visit to the Moscow Metro, where he marveled at what a beautiful and amazing work of art the Moscow Metro is, and also to a grocery store in Moscow with bread um, that he was really excited about because obviously post-Soviet Russian propagandists want to tout the fact that Moscow now has bread again. And that's a great achievement of their tweaks to the Soviet oppression that came before them. But the point is, well, it's still in this aside. It's hilarious that if you look at the history, um, Lazar Kaganovich, a close confidant of Joseph Stalin, was the main art designer and builder in chief of the Moscow Metro, and also one of the main designers in chief of the Soviet mass starvation of Ukrainians that happened during the 30s as a result of Bolshevism's early attempts at controlling agriculture centrally. Um, and hilariously, since Tucker was kind of partly in Russia to help whitewash Russia's war against Ukraine, it's kind of a funny point that he was delighting and marveling so much at the Moscow Metro, which, as we said, was created by Lazar Kaganovich, a Jew who was a close confidant of Joseph Stalin, who also helped Joseph Stalin starve to death untold numbers of Ukrainians, which, from the perspective of Ukrainians, may have actually helped cement their feeling that they weren't so happy with Russian imperialism ruling over them, and perhaps increased the zeal with which they therefore embraced their Nazi allies against the Soviet regime. So it's a very complex brew there, but just a note to Tucker, if you want to say that the way that I exit out of all of those contradictions is just to blame the Jew, go ahead, knock yourself out, Tucker. That would add yet another point in your connect the dots game.